Lightsabers have been a part of pop culture ever since Luke Skywalker ignited his father's blue blade for the first time in Ben Kenobi's cave, way back in 1977. But there's way more to lightsaber combat than just swinging a blade and hoping for the best. The Legends continuity created 7 distinct lightsaber forms as well as complementary variants and techniques which most people will be familiar with. However, there are also over 10 other techniques that are rarely ever mentioned. In this video, we'll take a look at all the different techniques there are and how they define their respective user. Let's start in the very beginning, with the oldest form of them all, Shi-Cho. In Jedi vs. Sith, The Essential Guide to the Force, we learn that it was developed in ancient times during the transition period from metallic swords to lightsabers. By the way, I'll be referring to this book a lot throughout this video, so I highly recommend giving it a read. Technically, it's a legend source, but most of it remains consistent with the current canon. Shi-Cho was also known as the Way of the Sarlacc, or the Determination Way. Its swordplay was simplistic and raw with sweeping strokes. This made Form 1 especially suitable against multiple opponents. The downside was that a single adversary could potentially find openings. Shi-Cho was the first form taught to Jedi initiates, as it taught them the basics of blocking and deflecting. It was also common to practice the latter blindfolded, as we see with Luke Skywalker in Episode 4. Usually, Jedi left Shi-Cho behind to focus on other forms because of its limitations. Nonetheless, some masters continued to specialize in it, most notably Kit Fisto, as we see in the Clone Wars. Another key trait of Shi-Cho was its tendency to produce an emotional state. This often triggered the temptation to strike with lethal intent during duels. However, the novel, The Cestus Deception, explains that the style was designed primarily for disarming, not killing. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. Next up is Form 2, commonly known as Makashi. This is arguably the purest lightsaber dueling form and emerged during an era of increased engagements between Jedi and Darksiders. Form 1 had too many vulnerabilities for single combat against lightsaber-wielding foes, so Makashi evolved into a critical form during the Old Republic era. The article Fight Saber, Jedi Lightsaber Combat from issue 62 of Star Wars Insider explains that Makashi depended on precision swordplay to counter the sweeping movements of Shi-Cho. There was also a heavy focus on the avoidance of being disarmed because this was a key aspect of Form 1. We see in the Old Republic games that many regular soldiers also carried vibroblades and other melee weapons because there were so many Force users active during this period. Makashi practitioners were typically elegant, calm, precise, and borderline arrogant in nature. Count Dooku was definitely the most famous Form 2 stylist, and his lightsaber shape reflected his preference. The curved hilt allowed for greater blade manipulation and control. Form 2 gradually fell out of favor after the defeat of the Sith in the new Sith Wars in 1000 BBY. Jedi no longer commonly faced the likelihood of fighting other lightsaber users. Instead, it was blaster fire that represented the most regular threat, so they preferred focusing on Ceresu and Niman instead because of their defensive advantages. Ironically, this was what made Dooku so dangerous against the Jedi because so few of them were optimized for elite lightsaber dueling. Makashi could be vulnerable against heavy power styles like Jim-So, as Dooku discovered when he fought Anakin Skywalker in Episode 3. Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith novelization does a superb job of breaking down their stylistic differences and how Anakin's overwhelming pressure from Form 5 made him a nightmare matchup for Dooku. Obi-Wan Kenobi's mastery of Form 3 made it arguably the most iconic of them all. It's definitely got the most awesome opening stance, as we've seen Kenobi use many times throughout the Clone Wars series and prequel movies. Surisu is famously defensive in nature and very effective against sustained blaster fire. The Revenge of the Sith novelization emphasizes how it's like being in the eye of a storm. It emphasizes short, precise movements and focuses on exhausting opponents before finally striking. The weakness of this was that the Form 3 practitioner could also fall victim to fatigue if they weren't careful. Nonetheless, it was extremely effective when used properly, and that's why the Jedi Council specifically chose Obi-Wan to confront General Grievous. In Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Jedi Master Kreia says that it's an excellent offensive technique against blasters, but less effective in saber dueling. Obi-Wan would disagree, but he also blended it with Ataru and other forms to create a more rounded style. It's also notable that Surisu became one of the definitive Jedi forms because its defensive emphasis correlated with the Order's philosophy. The Sith mostly treated it with contempt because they regarded it as weak and pointless. However, there was at least one notable exception. In the Darth Bane novel, we see how the pragmatic Sith Lord advised his apprentice Darth Zana to focus on Surisu. He noted that she lacked the physical traits required for more aggressive forms like Juyo or Jimso. Luminara Unduli was probably the second most famous Surisu practitioner during the Clone Wars era, using it to outlast aggressive opponents, as we see in the arena on Geonosis. Next, we have Form 4, commonly known as Ataru. This was an aggressive lightsaber form that depended on a combination of acrobatics and agility. In Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Jedi Master Zez Kyle explains that it's most effective against single opponents. Its history extended back as early as the Mandalorian Wars and remained popular into the New Jedi Order era in Legends. Practitioners of the Force could overcome their physical limitations and perform amazing physical feats as they fought. The most iconic example of this is Master Yoda. Despite being over 800 years old and depending on this gimbal stick or a hover chair to move around, he was a master of Form 4. The Force fueled him in combat situations, allowing him to move with remarkable fluidity, speed, and controlled aggression. His duel with Count Dooku in Episode 2 is one of the best in the franchise. He had the Sith Lord beaten before Dooku distracted him by attempting to crush Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ataru's strengths were also its weaknesses. It was most effective in open spaces because this allowed the practitioner enough mobility for dramatic acrobatic maneuvers. Qui-Gon Jinn was also a notable Ataru stylist and was unable to use it to its full capacity in the tight corridors of the generator complex of the Theed Royal Palace. Darth Maul exploited this in Episode 1, stabbing him through the chest with his double-bladed lightsaber. This was also why Obi-Wan shifted to Surisu after this duel, because he saw Ataru's limitations and he wanted a more balanced style. However, Obi-Wan got his revenge by using Form 4's opening stance to distract Maul in their final duel on Tatooine in the Star Wars Rebels series. Maul instantly went for the same finish he used against Qui-Gon as Obi-Wan expected. The Crimson Empire series explains that Yoda taught Luke Skywalker the essentials of Form 4, while Mara Jade and Kyle Katarn also used Ataru upon occasion in Legends. Form 5 is the first lightsaber style with two distinct variants. The earliest version of this is the classical style known as Xian. This was created by Form 3 masters who wanted a more aggressive component in their fighting style. The Fight Saber article explains that it required a high level of physical conditioning because of its focus on dominating opponents. Again, this is emphasized in the Jedi Path, a manual for students of the Force. Xian existed as early as the Jedi Civil War in 3959 BBY and had an emphasis on deflecting blaster bolts while retaining defensive capabilities. Star Wars: The Force Unleashed also mentions another variant called Sith Xian, although we have no other mention of this in Legends or canon. Xian had two notable opening stances. The first saw the practitioner raise the lightsaber hilt in a two-handed grip above their head. Meanwhile, some stylists preferred the reverse Xian grip, as famously used by Ahsoka Tano. This is controversial for obvious reasons, but there's no denying that it looks awesome. The reverse grip allowed the user to perform long, sweeping strikes, whipping the blade with the movement of a punch. One of the best examples of this is in the Season 2 finale of Star Wars Rebels, when a blinded Kanan Jarrus fights Maul. Kanan switches from his favored Surisu to a Xian reverse grip because it allowed him to center himself through the Force. He used this to outmaneuver Maul before throwing him off the edge of the Sith Temple. Next up is the second variant of Form 5, known as Jimso. Again, it was a response to Surisu, with many masters believing that it was too passive. Immediately after defending against an opponent's strike, a Jimso user would follow with a blow of their own. They sought to use the force of their foe's blade against them and sought to dominate them. Again, probably the best example of this in the motion pictures was Anakin's defeat of Count Dooku in Episode 3. It placed a heavier emphasis on brute strength than the Xi'an variant. In the Revenge of the Sith novelization, we get more details about the duel. The book gives Dooku's perspective as Anakin fools him by shifting from a Xi'an opening stance to Ataru acrobatics before unleashing his preferred heavy Jimso strikes. Jimso also has a very distinctive attack stance, favored by Ayla Secura throughout the prequel movies. This consisted of holding the lightsaber above the head, angled back and down at 45 degrees. It was typically more effective against single opponents than Xi'an. However, the main disadvantage of Jimso was its relative lack of mobility. That's why most Form 5 masters blended it with more mobile styles such as Ataru. Darth Vader used Jimso with brutal effect against Luke Skywalker on Bespin, slicing off his son's hand. Luke responded with his own powerful display of Form 5 as he furiously beat down Vader on the Death Star in Episode 6, although he opted to show his father mercy. In The Jedi Path, a manual for students of the Force, Luke notes that it was essential to balance Form 5's natural aggression with compassion because of the risk of flirting with the dark side. This brings us to Form 6, known as Niman, or commonly referred to as the Way of the Rancor and the Diplomat's form. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is one of the two most controversial lightsaber forms. Many fans have a low opinion of Niman because it's primarily associated with Jedi consulars. According to legend sources such as the Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia, the Niman fighting style was originally practiced by the awesomely named Royal Macateros of the Kashmir dynasty. Then the Legions of Leto, a group of dark side renegades, adopted it during the First Great Schism of the Jedi Order in 24500 BBY. After defeating them, the Jedi Order adopted Niman before gradually refining it over thousands of years into the sixth lightsaber form. Niman was known for its balance of attack and defense, making it more versatile than other saber styles. Unfortunately, it also became the default for Jedi who only wanted to focus on the fundamentals of saber fighting. Jedi consulars who favored diplomacy and meditation over combat often chose Niman because it gave them a base in lightsaber combat. However, its critics derided it as insufficiently demanding. This was slightly unfair to Form 6, as I'll explain in a moment, because there's definitely more nuance to it. It became one of the most popular forms during the High Republic era. Remember, this was basically 1,000 years of relative peace across the developed galaxy. This would eventually cost the Jedi dearly because it was extremely ineffective in the open battlefields of the Clone Wars, as we saw in Episode 2. I want to defend Form 6 a bit because it's also true that many of the Jedi who chose Niman as their base form often didn't use it to its full potential. They were jacks of all trades, rather true Form 6 masters. Before the Battle of Geonosis, Mace Windu literally gathered every Jedi available in the temple, including librarians and lore keepers who shouldn't have been within a Minox tail of a battlefield. According to the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide, Exar Kun, the notorious Dark Lord of the Sith, chose Niman as his favored lightsaber discipline, and he was lethal on the battlefield. Darth Sidious also blended Niman with Juyo, so there's no doubt that it was extremely effective when used properly. Now we're on to the final canon Jedi lightsaber discipline, Form 7. Again, like Form 5, this has two distinct variants. Let's start with the oldest, which is called Juyo, and is probably associated with the Sith more than any other form. Nicknamed the Way of the Vornskir, or the Ferocity form, the name almost says everything you need to know. It may be a surprise, but some Jedi used it during the Old Republic era, including Vrook Lamar, Zez Kayel, and Kavar. Maybe it's not such a surprise that so many of their counterparts fell to the dark side during conflicts like the Great Sith War and the Jedi Civil War. It would have been very tempting to use Juyo during this period of near-endless war because it was widely regarded as the most vicious lightsaber form. In Knights of the Old Republic 2, Kreia taught Mitra Surik that it was a surrender to the Force and chaos. It had a high focus on channeling one's internal emotions to gain an advantage in battle. The Force Unleashed novelization described Juyo as being filled with a malignant grace. Meanwhile, Knights of Fate developed this by saying it contained techniques that Form 1 rejected millennia earlier. Because of this, Juyo eventually became taboo amongst the Jedi because of the risk involved, and how it deviated from the values espoused by the Jedi Code. Darth Maul is probably the most famous Juyo practitioner in canon, although his former master Darth Sidious also blended it with Niman. We can see how Maul unleashed ferocious strikes with his double-bladed lightsaber, combining these slashes with martial arts techniques, including kicks and punches. The Fight Saber article explains how Jedi Battlemaster Sindralig saw some similarities between Juyo's acrobatics and Ataru's. However, Juyo was less predictable and far less graceful than Form 4. Returning to Knights of the Old Republic 2, Kreia also explained that Juyo sacrifices much to bolster the offense, leaving the practitioner vulnerable to attacks through the Force. Galen Merrick was proficient in Juyo in The Force Unleashed, but perhaps more interestingly so was the Order 66 survivor Ram Koda, who was a rare Clone Wars-era Jedi user of the form. The second variant of Form 7 is possibly the coolest lightsaber form of them all. Created by Mace Windu with the help of his Weequay Jedi friend Sora Bulk, it was developed in the later years of the Republic. This made it one of the youngest lightsaber forms, but it was more than just a fighting style. In Jedi vs. Sith, the essential guide to the Force, we learn that it was a state of mind that led through the penumbra of the dark side. In the novel Shatterpoint, Windu named this variant Vapad after a beast on the planet Serapin. Vapad practitioners accepted the fury of their opponent and allowed themselves to enjoy the chaos of the fight. Multiple sources reveal that this was extremely dangerous for Jedi because they skirted the dark side. Almost every Vapad practitioner fell to darkness except for Mace Windu. Count Dooku eventually subverted Sora Bulk to his cause, but he believed that the form was weak without allowing oneself to fully succumb to the dark side. The Jedi Master, Quinlan Vos, also studied Vapad and became proficient in its skills. However, he too went down the same path as Sora Bulk before seeking redemption. In Legends, Mace's former apprentice Deba Bilaba also fell victim to the dangers of using Vapad, but the current canon continuity retconned her story. So what made Mace Windu different from everybody else? He created the form to address his own weaknesses by controlling his inner darkness and channeling it into a more positive force. His purple lightsaber has also come to reflect this delicate balancing of light and dark in popular fan lore, even if we know that it originated because Samuel L. Jackson wanted to stand out on the battlefield. An entire mythology has emerged from George Lucas saying yes to Jackson's request for a purple blade, which is pretty awesome. Mace was also one of the best duelists of his era. Lucas has confirmed in interviews that he genuinely had Darth Sidious at his mercy before Anakin's intervention. Of course, it's possible that Palpatine intentionally fought Mace knowing he would lose, with the overall goal of turning Anakin, but that's a different argument. Nonetheless, there's no doubt that Form 7 is both awesome and incredibly dangerous for both the practitioner and the opponent. Before continuing, I want to briefly discuss the Forbidden Forms because they only exist in canon. The sole mention of the Forbidden Forms appears in the High Republic, A Test of Courage. Basically, they were a style of lightsaber combat used by Darksiders during the Sith Wars. In the novel, Vernestra Woe refers to the testimonies of Serval the Uncanny, an ancient Jedi. According to this lore, the Light Whip emerged as a direct response to the Forbidden Forms, because their flexible blades help defend against the Sith's dark techniques. That's pretty much all we've got on the Forbidden Forms, but perhaps they'll appear again. For the next few minutes, I want to focus on the Legends continuity because 3 new forms emerged during the New Jedi Order era between 25 and 37 ABY. According to Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, these were called the Strong Style, the Medium Style, and the Fast Style. These forms originated before the development of the 7 lightsaber forms as they currently exist in canon, but the New Jedi Order authors actually retconned these 3 styles to include elements from the Old Republic forms. Let's start with the Strong Style, because it was based primarily on wide, powerful strikes to batter through an opponent's defenses. It shared many features with the strength-oriented Form 5, as well as the very aggressive Juyo. Kyle Katarn and Desan used it in the Jedi Knight video game series. The Medium Style bore similarities to Shicho and Niman because it balanced offense and defense. In the Jedi Knight series, we learned that it was the first lightsaber style that new Jedi acolytes learned before they specialized. It was based on a perfect equilibrium of speed and power, but it often left less skilled practitioners vulnerable to more talented, strong, or fast-style duelists. Again, it was similar to Form 6 in that regard. Finally, the fast style was actually a defensive discipline, contrary to its name. It bore some resemblance to Sarisu in that practitioners kept their blades close to their bodies and depended on short, tight movements. This made the fast style very effective against blaster fire, although it could be overwhelmed by stronger foes. There were also resemblances to Ataru because of its acrobatic rolls and jumps. We don't get a huge amount of background lore about these lightsaber styles, but it's fascinating to remember them nonetheless. Before wrapping up this video, I want to mention some of the most iconic lightsaber skills that emerged from the official 7 forms. Some of these are complex disciplines that almost exist as separate variants in their own right. Others are lightsaber techniques that duelists incorporate into their preferred styles and forms. Let's start with Jarkai, because this is one of the most awesome. In short, this is a method of wielding 2 or more lightsabers in combat. Dual blade combat actually emerged from Niman, but it became compatible with several forms. For example, Asajj Ventress famously used 2 full-length lightsabers during the Clone Wars, blending Jarkai into her preferred Makashi. Luminara Unduli was even able to identify that she had trained with Count Dooku. Ahsoka Tano was another Clone Wars-era Jarkai practitioner. A Xi'an practitioner, Ahsoka used a yellow Shoto lightsaber alongside her usual full-length green saber in many combat scenarios. Later, after leaving the Jedi, she swapped these for a pair of standard lightsabers with white blades, as we saw in the Ahsoka TV show. Perhaps the most awesome and terrifying example of Jarkai was Pong Krell on Umbar in the Clone Wars series. The Basilisk Fallen Jedi dual-wielded 2 double-bladed lightsabers to devastating effect on Umbara against the clone forces. Almost equally terrifying was General Grievous, who could split his arms in 2 so that he could use 4 sabers at once. He was even able to rotate his wrists 360 degrees for a devastating buzzsaw effect. Jarkai was most commonly used against multiple opponents attacking from different directions. However, it could leave them defensively exposed, as we saw when Anakin Skywalker used Obi-Wan's saber alongside his own against Count Dooku in Episode 2. In the Legends Legacy of the Force series, Luke Skywalker even used a red Shoto as he fought the Dark Jedi Lumia and her saber whip. Most people watching this video also love the Legends continuity, but there's no denying it throws up some weird stuff occasionally. Trisp Zest is a perfect example of this. Basically, it's a combination of Form 7 with traditional Skytree aerial dueling. According to the Dark Forces saga, the name meant heart palpitation in the Skytrick language. Trisp Zest allowed practitioners to fly in battle against grounded units. The winged Skytree used the Sai Cha technique to swoop down and decapitate ground units. The Dark Jedi Maw adopted Trisp Zest as a skill after he lost his legs and learned to levitate using the dark side of the Force. He used this ability in his duel against Kyle Katarn in the Jedi Knight series. It's highly conceivable that other winged aliens could use Trisp Zest, but there's one issue. There are very few winged alien species in Star Wars canon or Legends. Toydarians and Geonosians jump out as the obvious examples, but neither species has ever produced a Jedi in any continuity. Meanwhile, Trisp Zest has one massive vulnerability. Practitioners were vulnerable to direct attacks from below, as Maw discovered against Kyle Katarn. Trickata is one of the most epic styles of lightsaber combat. It's not an official form in itself, but kind of exists outside as a unique skill. Basically, it involves turning a lightsaber on and off during a fight. According to the Jedi Academy training manual, there were several ways to use Trickata. One method was passing the blade, which saw the duelist deactivate their saber to bypass the opponent's block before reigniting it into their body. Corran Horn used this technique to kill Shadao Shai on Ithor during the Yuuzhan Vong War in the new Jedi Order novel Dark Tide 1. Another variant saw the duelist catch the opponent's blade on their own before momentarily deactivating it to leave them off balance. Tahiri Vela did this to Ben Solo in Legacy of the Force, Invincible, leaving him with barely any time to react. Trickata officially exists in canon, with the most famous practitioner being the Stranger in the Acolyte, as he used it against the Jedi on Kofar. He also uniquely used his Cortosis Ore helmet to knock out his opponent's lightsabers with deadly consequences. Trickata is awesome, but extremely dangerous for inexperienced duelists because it depends on perfect timing. Sokan is a principle of lightsaber combat rather than a form in itself. Basically, it's spatial awareness and using the physical environment to one's advantage. According to the complete Star Wars Encyclopedia, Jedi developed Sokan as a concept during the Great Hyperspace War. It was a crucial element of Ataru because this form required more physical space for its acrobatics. Yoda demonstrated this during his duel with Count Dooku on Geonosis as he performed a 3-point leap to evade the Sith Lord's strikes before launching a counterattack. Meanwhile, Darth Maul used Sokan in a highly skillful and cerebral manner when he lured Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon into the plasma refinery complex on Theed in Episode 1. I already mentioned how tight spaces were one of the weaknesses of Ataru, so he led Qui-Gon directly into a trap. Another clear example of Sokan was during Obi-Wan and Anakin's iconic duel on Mustafar. Obi-Wan claimed the high ground, allowing him to scythe the legs from beneath his former student when he insisted on pressing forward. Vader learned from this crucial error, as we saw when he dueled Luke Skywalker on the Death Star in Episode 6. He didn't pursue him when Luke achieved a higher position, but instead flung his lightsaber at his son. Sokan, as a name, only exists in Legends, but as we can see, there are plenty of canon examples of this lightsaber principle. Dunmok was a form of lightsaber combat almost totally associated with the Sith. It first appeared in canon in the source book Disciples of Harmony. Basically, it involved taunting the opponent, jeering, and sowing internal turmoil. Darth Sidious was one of the ultimate masters of this technique, as we saw when Luke Skywalker dueled Darth Vader. The Emperor taunted the young Jedi, telling him that his friends were dying. In Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, Desan used Dunmok to great effect. He enraged Kyle Katarn by falsely convincing him that his friend Jen Ors had died, and used this to trick him into revealing the location of the Valley of the Jedi. It was unusual for Jedi to resort to this skill, but there are examples in canon and legends. The former Jedi Master and Sith Lord, Kreia, advised the Jedi exile Mitra Surik to use Dunmok against Darth Sion. We saw in Knights of the Old Republic 2 how she taunted the Lord of Pain, eroding his will until he eventually decided to sacrifice his own life to the Force. It's also arguable that Obi-Wan Kenobi used a form of Dunmok in his duels against Asajj Ventress and General Grievous, as he used his restrained sense of humor to enrage his opponents. Form Zero is fascinating because it's effectively the art of not using the lightsaber at all. Technically, it's an ethical principle rather than an actual physical form. It does exist as a concept in canon, but there's far more development in the Legends continuity, as there tends to be with these technical aspects. It's primarily a Jedi concept about knowing when to ignite a lightsaber. Instead, Jedi should look for other, less aggressive ways of resolving a confrontation. In Jedi vs. Sith, a manual for students of the Force, Yoda advocated using techniques like mind tricks instead of resorting to aggressive negotiations. In Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, Kyle Katarn advocated Form Zero in another way. He explained to his students that the mere sight of a lightsaber could end a fight before it began. Next up is a lightsaber style or technique that we know almost nothing about. Count Dooku mentioned Lusma in the Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil. The Sith Lord observed General Grievous training with his Magna Guards. He noted that they used Lusma to answer a Sarisu move. This is one that we shouldn't read too much into. Perhaps it was a style of blade interception, but we don't have much to go on apart from this. Dulon appears in the Clone Wars Visual Dictionary as well as several legend sources. It is a special Padawan training exercise where the apprentice practices a sequence of movements against imaginary opponents. Dulon could also refer to a lightsaber move with the hilt's pommel held around the midsection with the blade 30 degrees up. The user would bring their saber up around the back of their body and slash at a high velocity. Telekinetic lightsaber combat is almost a separate art in itself. We see several examples of this in canon and legends. I've already mentioned Darth Vader throwing his lightsaber, but this was the first time we saw it in practice on the big screen. Galen Marek was also elite at throwing his lightsaber in The Force Awakens. Arguably, the most dramatic example is in Knights of the Old Republic 2, when Darth Traya uses telekinesis to control 3 lightsabers at once in her duel against Mitra Surik. Darth Bane also used telekinesis to kill 3 young boys with his lightsaber in a horrendous incident. Another notable technique was the Saber Barrier. This consisted of having the lightsabers whirl in a horizontal circle around the practitioner, creating a deadly defensive wall. This occurred in the New Jedi Order novels. I also have to mention Kylo Ren igniting Rey's lightsaber with the Force in Episode 8, killing Supreme Commander Snoke. This isn't the purest example of telekinetic lightsaber combat, but it was superb timing and awareness. The last aspect I want to discuss is mounted lightsaber combat. This occurs when lightsaber wielders fight from the back of an animal, like a tauntaun, or a vehicle like a swoop bike. It's unknown how much the Jedi actually trained this, or if most of them improvised when they found themselves in this situation. Typically, they would swing their lightsaber from one hand while holding their mount with the other. One of the best examples from the original animated Clone Wars series saw Yoda riding a Kaibuck into battle. Meanwhile, during the Battle of Munalist, Obi-Wan faced Dirge riding a swoop bike. Mounted lightsaber combat was also visible during the Beast Wars on Onderon during the Old Republic era. Of course, I can't forget about Obi-Wan riding Boga the Varactyl in Revenge of the Sith, even if he used an Electro Staff instead of a lightsaber. Nonetheless, he still applied the same skills, albeit with a different weapon.